So the next session that I want to talk about is looking at contextual effects in longitudinal studies. And I did an edited book a while back looking at these contextual effects where I invited a number of individuals to talk about different ways for representing context. Now, the reason we did this is at the time, my postdoc, Noel A, and I were reviewing a whole bunch of developmental psychology articles for a meta-analysis. And we were noticing that in the discussion section, one of the limitations is sections almost always mentioned, well, of course, context may impact the results of this particular study. Well, if you think context might have an impact, why don't you bring it into your analyses? And so we did a grant proposal to NSF, which was funded, and we invited a bunch of quantitative experts to talk about different ways to model contextual effects in longitudinal studies. And then, as you can kind of see from the cover, there were also some theoretical models that we're looking at. So context are the circumstances in which an event occurs, or the setting and the set of features that influences the performance or the outcomes of a process. So basically, we can think about the conditions that are relevant to an event. So we can look at the origins of context. So contextus, a putting together, or contextera, the interweaving, the braiding. So we think about the circumstances, the conditions, the situation, ambience, the frame of reference, the background. And then we can go also to talk about the ecology, the relationships between organisms and their environment. So there were three different models that were presented that looked at ecology. There's the social ecology, the personal ecology, and the physical ecology. And I have this represented as kind of a Venn diagram because they do overlap with each other. But the social ecology, this is Bronfenbrenner's famous model, looking at the microsystem within person, the mesosystem, which is the relationships between me and my siblings, my peers, my parents. We move into the exosystem. We get into the larger macrosystem. And of course, there's the chronosystem, that these relationships within a time point might change over time, especially when we start thinking about events like COVID-19, massive influence on how these relationships would have changed because of the influence of a macro chronosystem event like a pandemic. Or earlier on in my first edition of the book, we talked about 9/11 and how that impacted so many relationships of these nested structures, right? And so one key point here is that these are all nested within one another. And so analytically, this is where we start looking at more of the multi-level representations of how things might be changing across these different systems. Keith Wiedemann introduced the idea of physical ecology, and there he wanted to emphasize epigenetic phenomenon and how that might change as a function of exterior relationships might influence genetic expressions over time. And so he kind of talked about the neighborhood impacts from a sociological perspective, as well as regional system, the country system, and he introduced the idea of historical time, which again is the impact of things like 9/11 and COVID, and how they might have impacted country level relationships, regional relationships, neighborhood effects, and what he called local or home relationships. And in the chapter that I introduced, I talked a little bit about genes, ages. So here we're talking about childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, adulthood, old age, and what is often referred to as old age, if you're lucky enough to get there, and how those relationships are, how the affective system is impacted, and how the behavioral cognitive systems are impacted. Now, I like to call these the ABCs of measurement. So when you're thinking about representing developmental changes over time, I like to bring in affective measures, things like positive and negative affect, but also behavioral and cognitive systems, to really look at the interrelationships among these systems and how they might change over historical time. Now, when we think about context as statistical relationships, all right, so any of these things can be measured. I can measure the affective system with constructs. I can develop a measure for behavioral variables, cognitive related variables, and then I can measure and represent them as direct effects over time, such as in a panel model. I can also have them be indirect effects. So X varies at the level of the individual and influences the individual through its effect on an intervening variable. When I have longitudinal data and I control for prior levels, this could be called a mediated effect. But sometimes with cross-sectional data, it's only an indirect effect. And we'll get into that in detail when we talk about mediation in detail. And again, mediating effects is when there are distal contextual influences, the proximal context, which influences the individual. Right? And again, we have to have longitudinal data and we have to control for prior levels in order for us to talk about it being a mediating influence. Now, moderating influences is the ultimate context effects. So we have the interactive relationships that changes the strength of any association of the direct effects, indirect effects, or mediating effects. Now, moderators can be discrete, such as a grouping variable, gender, ethnicity, control group versus intervention group, or it can be a continuous variable. Right? And moderating influencers basically when we put in an interaction term and look, does the interaction have an influence on an outcome that tells us that of the two variables that are predicting the outcome, one of them is changing the strength of the relationship of, say, X to Y as a function of either a discrete moderator or a continuous moderator. When we have longitudinal data sets, we can also begin to look at reciprocal effects and feedback loops. Right? So a reciprocal effect would be when we have cross-legged influences that are, so say X to Y is strong, but so is Y to X. And it continues as an X to Y and Y to X, X to Y and Y to X over time. Then we see that that's a reciprocal process. A feedback loop would be something where we see X to Y between time 1 and time 2, but then we see Y to X between time 2 to time 3, and then again we see X to Y between time 3 and time 4, right? That would be kind of an up and down feedback process. And then lastly, we'll have those hierarchically nested effects. So if you go back to the diagrams of the social ecology or the personal ecology or the physical ecology, these are hierarchical nested effects. And that's when we get into multi-level modeling. And they too can have direct, indirect, mediating, and moderating effects, but they are in a hierarchically nested pattern of relationships. So statistically speaking, any pattern of context can be represented. Just how do we represent it and where are we focused theoretically on the change process? Is it like a hierarchical nested growth curve model, or is it a reciprocal panel model, or a random intercept version of the panel model? Now pause here. Do you have any questions or thoughts? So types of variables. One of the things that was kind of confusing for folks when you read the literatures and where they're reading the literatures in econometrics or developmental psychology or biostatistics, variables go by many different names, but essentially there's three core categories that I talk about as being the category of covariates, predictors, and outcomes. So in some literatures, they're called exogenous variables or independent variables, predictor variables, antecedent variables, causal variables, dependent variables, endogenous variables, outcome variables, consequent variables. And so I kind of gathered up this list just to say, here's all the different ways that we can talk about these things, but really covariates are things that we want to control for. Predictors are the things that we think are important as influencing variables that are causal in a sense, that represent how do we get to have changes in outcome variables, right? But sometimes in longitudinal panel models, the variable can be both a predictor and an outcome. At time one, they're both predictors. And so when we look at cross-lagged effects, we're looking at the outcomes at time two, and then from time two to time three, and time three to time four, but we're still basically treating them as either predictors or outcomes. Now, we also have variable types in terms of, are they categorical in nature or are they metrical in nature? By metrical, I mean, do they satisfy at least an ordinal rank ordering versus interval versus ratio? Anything that's at least ordinal in nature, I would call that metrical. All right, so when the manifest variable is categorical, but the nature of the latent variable we're trying to model is also categorical, then we're looking at latent transition analysis. So we might be looking at changes in drug and alcohol use, and changes in the category of, am I an alcohol user, am I a drug user, and what does that look like as a transition analysis. When the manifest variable is categorical, but the latent variable is metrical, we're looking at latent trait analysis or item response theory. So item response theory basically says, okay, here's a whole bunch of ability items. Did you get this item correct or incorrect? And I use those correct versus incorrect responses to infer how smart you are. And that's a latent metrical variable, right? Intelligence. But I'm using a whole bunch of incorrect items to represent how intelligent you might be. When the manifest variable is metrical, but the latent variable is categorical, that's when we're getting into things like latent class and mixture modeling. We're looking for subgroups, which is a categorical variable based on metrically measured indicators. And then finally, when both the indicators are metrical and the latent variable is metrical, that's when we're getting into the latent variable analysis, the confirmatory factor analytic model, your standard structural equation model. And for the most part, we'll be focusing primarily on this latter box, which is the latent variable rendering of what's going on here. We can mix things a little bit. So think programs like M+ have the ability to bring in categorical indicators of latent variables. We can also have a latent variable panel model or a growth curve model based on metrical indicators of metrical latent constructs. And we can put on top of that a mixture model. So we can have layers of modeling. So we can look at growth mixture modeling, which is looking at categorically represented different change patterns in a otherwise metrically represented growth curve analysis with metrically measured indicators of the latent constructs. Thoughts or questions here? context and measurement. I love this quote from E.L. Thorndike back in 1918. He said, "Whatever exists at all exists in some amount, and to know it thoroughly involves knowing its quantity as well as its quality." And what Thorndike was emphasizing here, and this is no slight to folks who do qualitative research, basically, if you are a qualitative researcher and you identify something that's really important as a developmental phenomenon, then it's incumbent upon somebody with a psychometric background to figure out a way to measure that as an important quantity, because then we can begin to develop models to test and examine how important that phenomenon that you discovered through your qualitative inquiry, how important is that in the larger context? Now, what happens too often is people just take measures kind of haphazardly and put them together and assess people with, so-and-so's measure of efficacy, such and such's measure of attitudes, such and such's measures of beliefs, such and such's measure of cognition, and they don't match each other. They don't fit together in a way that is going to be useful for the research question. And also, developmentally, so many of the measures that are available, that are out there, are not meant to measure change. They're developed with things like test-retest reliability, where items that showed instability over time were removed, but in fact, those items may have been the most sensitive to change processes and probably should have been kept. And also, if we think about context, they should be quantified. So if we borrow from sociology how they represent different contexts, we don't use enough census tract information to sample from and then represent that level of information and how it might be influential on the persons living within certain census tracts. Those are things that we can measure and represent. We have data. We can also think about classroom climate, right? So we can develop measures of classroom climate, which is an important contextual effect that influences the development and changes of children within a given classroom. So it's really a matter of measurement. And if it exists, think about ways to measure it. And also, if you thinking about the relationship between measures and analyses, they should also not be haphazard. I remember when growth curve model first broke out on the scene, everybody that had 3 time points of data wanted immediately to fit a growth curve model to the data, when in fact, the data were not collected in a way that was going to be amenable to a growth curve analysis. In fact, almost all of the scales that use a Likert type scoring method from 1 to 7 are typically going to find a negative association between intercept and slope. So for example, if I'm measuring something like positive affect, and it's being measured on a 7-point scale, and at time 1, I say, I'm a 7, I am happy as heck, right? But at time 2, I'm actually happier. But you know what? I can't go above 7 on my Likert scale. So all you can detect is whether or not I have gone down in my positive affect. So what happens, or if I'm at the bottom, if I was like a 1 for positive affect, and let's say I went down in my positive affect at time 2, you can't detect that because the only thing you can detect is whether I've gone up. And so that's why you have this artifact of a negative correlation between intercept and slope for a growth curve model when they're measured on that Likert type scale. So the measurement process has to allow at subsequent time points that I could go up or that I could go down. And one of the techniques for doing that I talk about in my book and recently collaborated with an individual over in China or Taiwan on this, is to measure the relationships as a standing kind of variable at time 1, but then all subsequent time points are measured in terms of change. So relative to the previous time point, so we have a slider scale that the midpoint is marked as no change, and the left point is either the increased over time and the endpoint on the other is decreased over time, or vice versa. And then you take the change and add that to the time 1 score to get the person's time 2 score. So if they said they decreased, you subtract how much they decreased. If they said they increased, you add how much they increased. If they said there was no change, then you keep the same score. And you do that at each subsequent time point. Now, when you fit a growth curve model, it's possible for, so for example, people who are high at time 1 can get higher at the next time point and the next time point. So we call that the rich get richer, right? And we'll see that in studies that have used things like vocabulary in early childhood, where the size of my vocabulary at one age point is correlated with increases in my vocabulary over time. There, a growth curve model is appropriate because we can look at ups and downs in vocabulary growth. Right. So again, the question has to drive the measurement, and then the measurement drives the statistical model. Another thing we should also avoid is to avoid using short forms of existing scales. Short forms have the tendency to be less valid because when people create short forms, they typically are looking for items that correlate most highly with each other. So they're looking to retain a certain level of reliability at the expense of validity. And Cattell referred to this process as the allure of the bloated specific. And what's happening here is when you keep items of a short form that have the highest reliability, the reason they have high reliability is that each of those items shares specific variance that is not necessarily related to the construct of interest. And the items that you removed may have actually been really good at measuring the construct of interest, but were kind of in a different space of construct space, that they were important for measuring the construct, but maybe they did lower the reliability, but they increased the validity. Now, we're going to introduce you to using intentionally missing data designs here. The multi-form plan missing data design, for example, allows you to create short forms, but your whole data frame has the full scale in it. But some of the items are in form 1, some of the items are in form 2, some of the items are in form 3, but because of the way we collect the data are going to be missing completely at random. And when we use a modern treatment for missing data, we were able to capture back all of that missing information such that my data frame contains all of the variables that I had interest in measuring. Another important point here is to develop or modify to make sure that the measurement tool is right for your circumstances. I was just consulting with a colleague who said, okay, here's all the constructs that I measure. Here's the original resource for them. This one was measured on a 4-point Likert scale from almost never to almost always. This one was measured on a 6-point Likert scale from never to always. And this one was measured with, using never, sometimes, seldom, often, always. Right. So all of the scales were on a slightly different way of measuring the construct. And I mentioned, it's like, look, just because the author used that 4-point Likert scale, it doesn't mean we can't put all of these constructs that generally are going from a never to a seldom onto a slider scale, anchored from always to never. And all of those particular items now can be modified. And also, if you look at the item content for this particular scale and the item content for this next scale, you see those two items, they're almost identically worded. For one of those two scales, you need to take that item out because it's going to create an undue level of correlation between those two constructs because a item or two was way too much overlapping in the way that they were worded. And so you collected up as a starting point these great scales, but now you need to modify them and adjust them for the fact that you're going to use both of them in the context of this particular study. Change the response scale to be similar so that the respondent doesn't have to bounce back and forth. You can also randomly control how these items are being administered so you don't have position effects of the items. And you can also use an intentionally missing data design when you develop it, right? So take the time to refine and pilot those measures, even ones that are quote unquote well established. It's okay to make those changes because one of the cool things about structural equation modeling is that we're going to start with the confirmatory factor analysis model. And that CFA model is your measurement model. It tells you how well you modified things. If that measurement model holds, then all the modifications that you made are appropriate.